In the early 2000s, a rare economic and cultural alignment occurred in Western Europe. A single municipality managed to convince global capital, urban planners, and millions of individuals that it had successfully engineered the perfect modern metropolis. This place possessed the rare architectural variants that forced pedestrian traffic to a complete halt, an unparalleled coastal modification, and a specialized nighttime economy that functioned continuous from midnight until dawn. It became the definitive benchmark for municipal success. Every major European mayor quietly attempted to replicate its blueprint. Then, a structural deceleration began. It did not manifest as a sudden market collapse or a dramatic infrastructural failure, but rather as a series of minor unrecorded frictions. Beyond the visibility of real estate marketing and digitized travel media, a fundamental systemic fracture has occurred. This transformation alters the baseline assumptions of what constitutes a stable urban economy. The most precise entry point for this analysis is not the visible civil unrest or localized property disputes, but a baseline structural paradox. In 2023, this specific municipal area recorded 32 million visitor arrivals. The permanent residential population stands at 1.6 million. The resulting ratio is exactly 20 temporary visitors for every single permanent resident. When distributed across a fixed urban geography, this scale of volume reconfigures the daily operations of transit networks, medical intake facilities, localized distribution hubs, and residential real estate sectors. The system did not fracture due to capital flight or municipal neglect. It fractured because it was monetized to the absolute limit of its physical capacity. This specific category of structural failure occurs in full public view, verified by macroeconomic indicators and municipal development strategies, until the point of systemic saturation is reached. This trajectory is not unique. It follows a well-documented historical precedent. The long-term stabilization of Venice did not dissolve instantaneously. The shift occurred through localized extractions. The sequential conversion of residential units, the steady departure of registered citizens, and the replacement of primary supply merchants with low-overhead retail stalls. The commercial capital of the Mediterranean slowly transitioned into an architectural shell. The permanent residential population of Venice currently sits below 50,000, down from a historical peak of nearly 200,000. This demographic exit was driven by an escalating cost floor and the total conversion of the local economy toward non-resident services. To map the speed of this current transformation, one must isolate the specific structural baseline established prior to the late 20th century. Before 1992, the Catalan capital operated primarily as an industrial hub with an economy sustained by manufacturing, regional maritime trade, and heavy port logistics. It possessed a highly distinct regional identity that had been reinforced by decades of political centralization, rendering it a highly localized, insular economic ecosystem rather than an international destination. The execution of the 1992 Summer Olympic Games altered this baseline with unprecedented velocity. The municipal government reclaimed 4 kilometers of coastal territory previously occupied by industrial rail corridors and heavy factories. It established new residential infrastructure on degraded industrial land, updated central transportation networks, and broadcasted this modified urban profile to a global audience of 3 billion viewers. The subsequent capital and consumer inflows scaled rapidly. Between 1990 and 2019, annual visitor arrivals increased by over 800%. No other major European metropolitan center recorded an equivalent rate of volume transformation during this specific window. The secondary distortions were entirely predictable, yet the underlying capital yields and positive media tracking disincentivized regulatory intervention. The introduction of decentralized short-term accommodation platforms accelerated this structural housing imbalance. Between 2015 and 2019, the volume of registered short-term rental units inside the urban core expanded by nearly 300%. The microeconomic incentive for property owners shifted rapidly. A standard 2-bedroom residential unit leased to a local wage earner yielded a fixed baseline of €200 per month. The identical asset transferred to a short-term digital platform generated 3 to 5 times that baseline yield. The resulting displacement altered the demographic composition of central districts within a matter of weeks. Property data records the sequential conversion of multifamily buildings into transient lodging. The long-term residential occupants were systematically displaced to peripheral zones located 40 to 50 minutes outside the urban center, while the primary real estate assets were repackaged and marketed exclusively for their localized authenticity. The specific cultural characteristics that attracted international capital became the exact assets liquidated by the market. This real estate distortion represents only the visible layer of a deeper economic vulnerability. Over a 20-year period, the broader municipal economy developed a critical dependence on a singular, highly volatile service sector. Tourism-related activity grew to command between 14 and 20% of total gross domestic product. Why is this high concentration exceptionally dangerous for a major urban economy? Because international consumer travel is highly sensitive to external shocks. It undergoes immediate contraction during public health emergencies, broader macroeconomic recessions, localized civil instability, or rapid shifts in consumer perception driven by digital media trends. The municipality effectively outsourced its long-term economic stability to a market segment governed entirely by external sentiment. Concurrently, this shift degraded the living conditions required by the resident population to sustain the very cultural infrastructure being monetized. By the mid-2010s, this structural imbalance began registering in internal municipal data. A comprehensive survey administered by the Barcelona City Council in 2017 revealed that 68% of permanent residents quantified the impact of this sector on their daily existence as strictly negative. This statistical consensus emerged from the population of a city whose entire post-industrial model had been organized around the expansion of this specific industry. The physical manifestations of this dissatisfaction appeared sequentially across the urban landscape. Direct markings on the infrastructure of the Gothic Quarter and the exterior surfaces of public transit vehicles detailed a stark divergence between rising rental costs and stagnant local wages. Long-term commercial storefronts specializing in primary goods were steadily replaced by standardized high-margin food and beverage franchises designed exclusively for transient consumer spending. By June 2024, the friction escalated from passive resistance to direct, targeted confrontation. In the coastal quarters traditionally occupied by maritime workers, organized groups of residents utilized low-velocity water devices directly against non-resident consumers occupying commercial spaces. While international reporting framed these events as an isolated social anomaly, the actions marked a definitive structural boundary. It indicated the complete dissolution of the internal social consensus required to sustain a hospitality-dependent economic model. The local population no longer viewed the influx as an economic driver, but as an extractive mechanism operating directly against their domestic stability. This systemic gridlock is currently functioning as an operational template across the European continent. A major urban center leverages its historical architecture and cultural density to transition from an industrial baseline to an international service hub. The incoming volume rapidly outpaces the projections of existing municipal infrastructure. Short-term real estate speculation hollows out the residential core, forcing the working population into the geographic periphery. As political pressure intensifies, the municipality enters a state of total policy paralysis. It cannot terminate the influx due to structural GDP dependence, and it cannot sustain the volume due to the complete breakdown of domestic stability. Amsterdam is currently navigating the advanced stages of this exact structural bottleneck. Lisbon is approaching the identical real estate saturation point far ahead of initial analytical models. Dubrovnik has operated within these constrained parameters for a decade, while Venice serves as the final empirical case study for the end state of this trajectory. The Catalan capital did not merely drift into this systemic layout, it engineered the original framework. Consequently, its current internal policy adjustments provide the first clear indicators of how this urban model behaves when it reaches absolute capacity. This friction crystallized when the municipal executive leadership announced a comprehensive legislative initiative targeting the total elimination of all short-term rental registrations by November 2028. This measure intends to reallocate approximately 10,000 real estate assets back into the primary residential market. It stands as the most disruptive regulatory intervention enacted by a major European territory in the modern era. While property investment groups launched immediate legal challenges and housing coalitions reported a temporary stabilization of expectations, Long-term structural data suggests that legislative announcements and actual market reclamation operate on vastly different timelines. The significance of the directive lies in its institutional admission. A metropolitan government that spent 3 decades optimizing its infrastructure for external consumption has been forced by internal political realities to explicitly prioritize the retention of its permanent tax base over international consumer yields. This is not a standard regulatory correction. It is a fundamental crisis of institutional identity. The underlying structural vulnerabilities run too deep for a single legislative mechanism to isolate, as the economic alternatives to this monoculture were left entirely uncultivated during the decades of uninhibited expansion. The precise nature of this economic vulnerability remains hidden beneath the city's physical architecture, and its full scale is only beginning to surface. While the institutional pivot of 2024 exposes the macroeconomic gridlock, the empirical reality of this transition is most legible within the physical interior of the city's primary distribution infrastructure. To observe how a diversified metropolitan economy hollows out from within, one must look beyond the legislative declarations and isolate the specific microzones where the daily transactions of human life have been systematically replaced by automated tourism delivery systems. The structural transformation is no longer a projection, it is written into the concrete, the silent corridors, and the changing layout of the city's oldest neighborhoods. The most precise documentation of this structural replacement occurs within the municipal market network. For over a century, the Mercat de la Boqueria on the La Rambla corridor functioned as the logistical heart of the city's fresh food supply, processing tons of primary commodities daily for local consumption. Today, a forensic inventory of the market floor reveals a near-total collapse of primary commerce. The traditional fishmongers, butchers, and poultry stalls that once anchored the interior have vanished, their spaces reclaimed by high-margin, immediate consumption retail operations. Where long-term residents once negotiated the daily cost of staples, there is now an absence of raw ingredients. The sensory profile of the market has shifted from a site of civic utility to a highly curated backdrop for mobile photography. The specialized local vendors did not exit due to general commercial failure. They were priced out by a deliberate municipal shift that prioritized the rapid turnover of low-overhead consumer products, such as pre-packaged sliced fruits, industrial empanadas, and plastic cups of mass-produced sangria. Over the complex logistics of a functional municipal food system, this commercial evacuation is not isolated to the central market corridors. It operates with geographical precision across distinct urban sectors. In the Ciutat Vella or Old City core, the retention rate of primary service businesses, such as cobblers, ironmongers, laundromats, and neighborhood bakeries, dropped by more than 70% over a 15-year tracking window. The physical space these businesses occupied has been uniformized. The streets present a repetitive landscape of luggage storage facilities, electric scooter rental depots, and standardized fast casual dining establishments. The absence of local commerce creates a specific urban silence during non-peak hours. The morning sounds of a functioning neighborhood, the delivery of wholesale regional goods, the interaction of long-term neighbors using the local Catalan dialect, the opening of localized workshops have been replaced by the uniform acoustic signature of multi-directional polyurethane wheels, tracking over historic cobblestones. To understand the systemic mechanics driving this displacement, we must examine the operational data of the regional real estate market, specifically within the highly organized grid of the Example district. Designed in the 19th century by Ildefons Cerdà, the Example was engineered specifically to maximize human health, public space, and social cohesion through wide, egalitarian blocks and internal courtyards. This historic urban planning achievement has been effectively converted into a highly optimized yield generator for transnational real estate investment trusts. Corporate registry records indicate that by 2025, over 35% of the residential assets within the central corridors of the Example had passed into the ownership of institutional investment funds and non-resident speculators. This concentration of capital completely decoupled the local housing market from the purchasing power of the domestic workforce. A standard entry-level salary for a young professional in the metropolitan area hovers around €1,500 to €1,800 per month after taxes. with the median monthly cost of a corporate-managed apartment in the same district ascending past €2,100. The domestic population faces a structural exclusion from the urban core. The human cost of this real estate inflation is verified by the demographic records of peripheral industrial zones. Municipal data tracking internal migration shows a massive, continuous displacement from the interior to external administrative districts like L'Hospitalet de Llobregat and Badalona. This is not a natural process of suburbanization, it is a forced economic evacuation. As a result, the historic core of the city experiences a rare form of demographic desertification. The public squares and interior courtyards designed by Cerdà to function as safe zones for children, and the elderly stand largely vacant during the school week. The infrastructure remains physically intact, but its social purpose has been entirely extracted. Why did the municipal administration allow this structural imbalance to reach the point of systemic fracture? The answer lies in the deep architecture of public finance and the long-term degradation of the region's industrial alternative sectors. Following the global financial crisis of 2008, when Spain's speculative construction sector collapsed, the municipal government faced an acute fiscal deficit and soaring unemployment metrics. The rapid expansion of international aviation agreements, paired with the unregulated rise of digital short-term rental platforms, offered an immediate, low-capital solution to generate liquidity. Tourism was transformed from a complementary economic sector into an emergency fiscal stabilizer. This strategic choice created a profound path dependency. Foreign direct investment flowed exclusively into hospitality infrastructure, hotel developments, and retail commercial real estate, systematically starving the high-tech manufacturing, research, and engineering sectors of the capital necessary to scale. The city's port, which historically functioned as a primary conduit for the export of heavy machinery, automotive components, and regional textiles, gradually pivoted its physical infrastructure to accommodate the specific logistical demands of giant Mediterranean cruise liners. By 2023, the Port of Barcelona was processing upwards of 3.5 million cruise passengers annually, establishing it as the most heavily utilized cruise terminal on the European continent. The environmental and structural impact of this specific volume is concentrated within a highly compressed geographic footprint. The massive vessels dump thousands of day trippers simultaneously into the historic center for windows of 4 to 6 hours. These transient consumers generate intense vertical pressure on public transit infrastructure and central pedestrian zones, while contributing negligible tax revenue to the long-term maintenance of the municipal system. The industry-level data reveals a highly unstable employment matrix underneath this model. The hospitality sector is characterized by low wage ceilings, seasonal insecurity, and a high reliance on outsourced labor networks. The traditional career path of the career hospitality professional has been dismantled, replaced by hyper-flexible, short-term contracting structures. Tenal labor union data shows that over 60% of housekeeping and food service workers in the urban core are employed via secondary agencies, exempting large hotel corporations from standard collective bargaining agreements. The workforce that physically maintains the glossy exterior of the destination cannot afford to live within 2 zones of their place of employment, resulting in a massive daily migration of low-wage commuters that strains the regional rail networks to the limit of their operational efficiency. The structural erosion has now penetrated the city's celebrated cultural institutions, revealing that even the artistic legacies used to market the metropolis are vulnerable to the logic of hyper-extraction. The architectural masterworks that once served as the primary symbols of regional pride have been isolated from the civic life of the city, functioning essentially as high-throughput revenue generation zones enclosed by security barriers and ticketing kiosks. The domestic population has largely ceased to interact with these spaces, viewing them as cordoned-off enclaves operating under a foreign commercial logic. This divorce between historic infrastructure and current community life marks the final stage of an over-tourism trajectory, where the living city is steadily transformed into a highly managed museum space, as the physical and economic boundaries of this model continue to contract. The long-term indicators suggest that the underlying structural decay has already begun to compromise the city's international standing. The systemic reliance on a single volatile service sector has created a brittle macroeconomic framework that is uniquely vulnerable to the next phase of global market realignment. The real estate market remains artificially inflated by corporate capital, while the social cohesion that once defined the city's unique urban identity continues to dissipate in the peripheral zones. The true scale of this economic miscalculation, however, extends far beyond the housing market and the changing patterns of local commerce. Behind these macroeconomic shifts and real estate balances are the specific human systems being systematically dismantled within the urban core. The conversion of a functional metropolis into an extractive commercial space does not simply alter real estate ledgers. It reconfigures the daily survival strategies of the individuals who historically generated the city's unique cultural infrastructure. To observe this transformation from the inside is to witness the steady erasure of a community's social memory, replaced by a hyper-optimized logistical apparatus that views permanent habitation as an operational inefficiency. The specific mechanism of this human displacement is legible in the changing daily routines of the city's aging population. In the historic quarters of Barceloneta, where multi-generational fishing families once anchored the coastal economy, the traditional social safety nets have dissolved. The physical layout of these neighborhoods, characterized by dense, low-tier apartment structures known as cuartos de casa, historically facilitated a highly integrated community life. Elderly residents relied on localized networks of proximity, a shared entryway, a known neighborhood merchant, or a family-operated pharmacy that managed long-term prescriptions on trust. Today, those specific nodes of civic security have vanished. A forensic examination of residential doorframes in these coastal blocks reveals a high density of digitized lockboxes and automated keyless entry systems. The long-term resident who steps into a communal stairwell is no longer surrounded by neighbors, but by a rapid rotation of international transient consumers. The sensory loss is precise and structural. It is the total absence of familiar names on the mailboxes, the cessation of local dialect in the common areas, and the physical isolation of the remaining elderly citizens who can no longer navigate an environment that has been fully repurposed for short-term leisure consumption. These individuals do not leave because of a preference for peripheral suburban life. They exit because the basic infrastructure of daily survival has been physically removed from their immediate geography. The structural pressure operates with equal force on the younger demographics and the local labor force, creating a profound generational impasse. Consider the standard trajectory of an educational professional or a healthcare worker assigned to a public facility within the metropolitan center. Internal administrative records indicate that a substantial percentage of essential public sector employees are now forced to reject contracts within the urban core due to the absolute lack of affordable housing options. The resulting systemic friction is severe. Public schools in districts like the Gothic Quarter experience high rates of teacher turnover, as staff face daily commutes of over 90 minutes each way from remote regional towns. The school districts themselves are hollowing out from within, as family units are displaced by real estate speculation. The student body numbers drop below the baseline required to justify the retention of public funding. The physical spaces where children once played in the afternoons are now occupied by outdoor restaurant terraces catering exclusively to foreign and spending, creating a stark visual contrast between a wealthy, transient consumer class and a disappearing domestic youth population. This human imbalance is further complicated by the stark realities of the low-wage service sector that physically maintains the glossy exterior of the metropolis. The hundreds of thousands of individuals who clean the luxury suites, prepare the standardized cuisine, and manage the logistics of the transient influx exist in a state of permanent economic precarity in the early mornings, hours before the first wave of international consumers occupies the central plazas. The regional commuter rail lines, transporting workers from the distant northern and western industrial peripheries, operate at absolute capacity. These commuters enter a city that has effectively zoned them out of its residential life, performing intensive physical labor to sustain an aesthetic of effortless leisure that they are structurally barred from participating in. The systemic consequence of this layout is the complete commodification of local culture, a process that converts authentic regional traditions into standardized commercial performances. A premier example of this extraction occurs within the traditional neighborhood festivals, such as the Festa Major de Gracia. Historically, These events functioned as highly localized, year-long community projects where residents collaborated to design complex, handcrafted street decorations that reflected neighborhood solidarity and regional political themes over a 15-year period. The scale of global travel promotion transformed these intimate neighborhood expressions into major international spectacles. The massive, unmanaged influx of millions of external visitors overwhelmed the physical capacity of the narrow residential corridors, turning a vital mechanism of civic cohesion into an unnavigable logistical crisis. The long-term residents who spent months constructing the decorations were forced to establish physical checkpoints to protect their property from the sheer volume of rancent foot traffic. Eventually, the social incentive to participate in these community traditions dissolved. The festivals continue to exist as a highly marketed tourism commodity, but the internal civic engine that gave them meaning has been entirely exhausted. The structural failure of this model lies in its fundamental miscalculation of what constitutes a sustainable urban asset. By treating its own beauty and cultural depth as an infinite, extractable resource, the municipality entered into a self-terminating cycle. The very characteristics that made the metropolis an international benchmark, its fierce regional pride, its organic neighborhood cohesion, its accessible public life, were the product of a population that had the stability to inhabit its own history. Once that stability was sacrificed to optimize the city for foreign capital, the production of authentic culture ceased. What remains is an architectural monument to an unsustainable appetite. The city continues to perform the gestures of its celebrated greatness under the permanent glare of international marketing, but the internal substance has been hollowed out with forensic precision. The historic core stands intact, brilliantly lit, and expertly curated, operating essentially as an open-air museum where the infrastructure of hospitality completely occupies the space where a living society once resided. The final turn of this trajectory is not a dramatic collapse, but the quiet, total normalization of an artifice. On the Grand Avenue of La Rambla, as the evening sun hits the polished facades of the historic buildings, the crowds of transient visitors continue to move through the designated tourist tracks, documenting an experience of localized authenticity that has ceased to exist anywhere on the grid. A few streets away, in the deep shadow of an ancient stone